Australian Musician welcomes authors Andy Neill and Greg Armstrong to the channel. We're talking to you today, guys, because you're the authors of a great new book called When We Was Fab, Inside the Beatles Australasian Tour 1964. And we're talking to 60 years ago today that the Beatles landed at Mascot Airport in Sydney, the actual B-Day landing.
I know. It's incredible, isn't it, that we're here today and we're still talking about it. And particularly for us, Andy has joined us from London and I'm from Melbourne, but we are actually talking to you live from Macleay Street. So in Sydney, the home of the Beatles at the Sheraton Hotel. It's the very place that they would be brought to immediately after that horrendously wet arrival today, 60 years ago.
Yeah. So you guys, like me, I gather would have been toddlers when this event was happening.
I wasn't even an embryo. I wasn't born till 65. So, through osmosis, I guess, I've just been interested in it this whole time.
Yeah.
And to confess, I was around. I was about 3.5 years old, a little young to remember them, but quite famously in my own mind, Mum took me to see a Hard Day's Night film in October 1964 for my 4th birthday. So it must have sunk in.
Yeah. So how did you two guys meet? How did this book come about?
Well, we'd both been working on wanting to do a book about the tour, but different parts of it. Like I'm originally from New Zealand. I've lived in the UK now for quite some time. And I'd always wanted, ever since I'd sort of more or less got into the Beatles, to write about the Beatles New Zealand tour, purely because I was so surprised that they actually found the time to come all the way from England when they had such a busy career. And I mean, busy is an understatement. They were recording, filming, touring. And in the 70s, when I became a Beatle fan, I saw some footage when I was still living in New Zealand of the Beatles arriving in Wellington. And I was astounded. I thought, my God, the Beatles actually came to my country. And so that planted the seed, which sort of developed over time to try and find out as much as I could about that tour. So I was sort of making notes and finding out about the tour, going to the library, digging out the newspapers from 1964, and just basically finding out all about that week they spent in New Zealand, and also making a note of the people that they connected with who had something to do with them while they were in New Zealand. And so that sort of became the genesis of a story. And I thought, yes, it's definitely a story worth telling. But as I went and did it, I thought, actually, it's not just the New Zealand tour that needs recounting. The whole tour needs talking about, because it was only 3 weeks in total, the actual touring part of it, but it was such a mammoth thing, not just the actual Beatles coming out and playing the concerts, but the effect they had on Australia and New Zealand, the society in general, the kids, but also adults as well, and the media, the whole sort of picture. It needed to be told properly. And so I'll hand you over to Greg, but he was sort of working on a similar idea about Australia. And over to Greg.
Yeah, I think it's exactly the same. Andy was looking to learn as much about the New Zealand tour as I was, pretty much at the same time, looking to do a deeper understanding for my own personal interest on the Australian tour. And it was purely that I've got an inquiring mind. I worked in the industry for records and document management, so I knew my way around archives. But I also wanted to know more than what was publicly available. We had one book on the Beatles tour, groundbreaking book, came out 42 years ago. And I love that book, but I knew when I was reading it that it fell short in some of the places that I wanted to know more, and that I was learning more things that were not in a book like that. So I thought, well, there's all this extra information. So I was going through newspaper archives. I was going through document archives. I was actually ringing up and getting in touch with people that were involved in the tour. And I wanted to learn and what they had to say themselves. And I recorded them, not knowing that it was for a book initially, but it became pretty apparent soon through a mutual friend, my friend Simon, Andy's friend Simon Smith. And Simon kept saying, "Oh, Greg, what have you found out now?" And I'd tell him, he goes, "Oh, that's incredible. No one knows this stuff. You got to write it down. You got to write it down." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, but what do I have to write it down for? I know it now." But after a year or two of that, and every time he saw me, "Tell me what you found now," and blown away. And he said, "No, that's it." And I started to turn my mind to thinking that, yes, you're probably right. It does need to be documented in a book. And I didn't know how to do a book. And he introduced me to his expat New Zealand mate, Andy Neill, and said, "Look, I know a guy that's doing similar work than you, and Australia and New Zealand really deserve to have a big book on this." And we were introduced, and as the rest, as they say in history, it is history. We joined up in about 2007, 8 maybe. We kept digging and digging. We were both very much of a like mind, and we were pulling on the same rope, which was fantastic. And we didn't feel that we had enough information for the 50th anniversary, and we're so glad that we didn't, because the treasure trove that we've discovered, even in, well, literally in the last 10 years, massive archives totaling thousands of pages of original vintage documents, let alone all the photographs that we've been able to acquire, or license or discover languishing in places that were unknown. That's been really just a journey that we did as a labour of love, and it's we've produced it into a book that we wanted to buy. And so I figured if we wanted to buy it and our friends were saying this is fantastic, then we figured, well, there's a place for a book like this on the bookshelves. It's a tour that isn't as well known around the world. Everyone celebrates the Ed Sullivan Show and various other things, but Australia needed to be more on the international Beatles map, and we felt that our book will make a strong contribution to that, getting the big story, the deep and complete story out there.
Yeah. I'm excited for the book is out. I'm excited to get my hands on it, because I must confess,
Yep.
I was a 5-year-old at Essendon Airport when the Beatles arrived. My mum and dad packed the family out, and we went out to the airport, and security guards would go around the back. They'll be coming out the back gate. And,
yes, they did.
And
Yes.
I remember Paul McCartney winding his window down and waving to me. So.
See, this is what a book like this is all about, and that's why we're here 60 years later to the very day talking about it, because everybody that was touched by them, whether they saw them at the concert, they're lining up on Mount Alexander Road or at the Essendon Aerodrome, they're in Anzac Highway in Adelaide, wherever you stepped out to see them. That is a lasting memory, and people are still, people are jealous that you went and saw them. It's living history.
Yeah, we had Taylor Swift here earlier in the year, Taylor Swift Mania, and it was hard to tell those fans that it was nothing compared to the Beatles tour. Can you put the record straight?
Well, I've drawn the not the short straw, but I'm the Taylor Swift official spokesman. I saw Taylor Swift in Melbourne this year. It was incredible. They're very hard to compare. 96,000 people at the MCG, they're people that paid tickets to see her concert. And in this day and age, you can play to venues that big. PA systems allow it. Venues are outdoors, they allow it. Back in 1964, you were playing indoor, smaller halls, festival hall. The biggest one we had was the Sydney Stadium, a big barn of a thing. But they were boxing venues, boxing and wrestling, and they had public address systems usually used for calling out round 2, round 3, that type of thing. The mania for the Beatles was entirely different than Taylor Swift, because people were lining the streets on Thursday, the 11th of June 1964, in the torrential rain, which had been lashing down for 3 weeks and had cut the power in central Sydney. Or they were lining the streets in Adelaide on not a public holiday, on Friday the 12th of June. Sunday the 14th, the Melbourne arrival, 250,000. These people are just trotting out to greet the Beatles in those numbers, not to see them play, basically to see them get off a plane, get in a car, and go to their hotel room. So that is a mania that was unique to the Beatles. To be fair, I don't see them doing that for Taylor, but plenty of people love her and see her, and I love her too, but see her in concerts. But no one had ever done that in those vast numbers before. There had been some spots of that, I think, in some earlier tours, but
nothing,
not on that
nothing
level.
on that scale. That was totally unprecedented, and it hasn't happened since. On to that degree where it affected people on so many different social levels. It wasn't just like teenagers or young kids, who were Beatle fans who bought Beatle records, but it was their parents and occasionally their grandparents. And I mean, if you look at the photos in the book of Adelaide, there's school teachers with school children. They've taken the Friday afternoon off to stand on Anzac Highway and just, it's just a microcosm of the society at that point. It was just completely besotted by the Beatles.
Yeah. One of the saddest photos I've ever seen is one of Jimmie Nicol at Essendon Airport going back to England, sitting on his own because Ringo didn't make it out initially. Yeah. Whatever happened to Jimmy?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. Nobody really knows, to be quite honest. I mean, there's lots of rumors and where he ended up and how he ended up and what have you, but we can't definitively give you an answer. I mean, there's stories that he went into the building trade at one point in the 1980s, and this one line of speculation that says he's still involved in that. But Jimmy was born in 1939, so that would make him 85 this year. So if he is still with us, God knows where he is. And he literally is just, it's a bit like the Loch Ness Monster. People say they've sighted him or sighted it, but no one can prove conclusively where he is and what he's doing.
I think the best evidence is he married a Mexican lady. He did spend time in Mexico in the later part of the 1960s. And the best evidence is that he went back to South America, to Mexico, and we believe he's still alive, but he doesn't want to be found. And he doesn't want to be interviewed about the Beatles story. He was threatening to do his own book in around about 1984, talking that up, but nothing came out. He doesn't want to define his whole life on that 11 days subbing for Ringo Starr during the Beatles world tour, or the Australasian tour. He went on and did other things. He's a drummer. He got lucky. He got seconded into the Beatles at the drop of a hat, literally, from the 3rd of June to being on stage in Denmark, in Copenhagen, on the 4th of June, playing 2 concerts with the Beatles. When they come back to Earth, back in London, after Ringo rejoined, he subbed for, who was it? Dave Clark. Dave Clark got sick as a drummer. Paradoxically, he'd be subbing for Dave Clark. But he went and joined the Spotniks, a Swedish outfit who toured the world and were quite successful. He finished his time with them, and he joined various other bands. I think he might have even been involved in some form of Beatles tribute in Mexico in 1969, which John Lennon makes a crack in the Peter Jackson film Get Back about Jimmie Nicol, the 39th Beatle.
Living in South America, Mexico.
And which we think is a direct reference to the fact that he was living in Mexico and he was doing Beatles-related events then. But no, Jim doesn't want to be found, and we respect that. Hope he gets to see a copy of the book one day.
I've only seen the preview of your book. One thing that I didn't know is the Beatles landed in Darwin. Though, were they en route to another city?
They certainly were en route to Australia. They'd come from Hong Kong, the previous stop.
Okay.
And because the weather was so poor in the eastern seaboard of Australia, for torrential rain for literally 3 weeks, wasn't it, Andy?
No, it was only a week.
A week.
It was just a week of really bad weather that hit the coast of New South Wales and sort of around the Blue Mountains and Bathurst around there.
Yeah.
Lots of flooding. and it was just fate that the Beatles happened to arrive in the middle of it.
So there was a plan that the Beatles plane may have to be diverted to Brisbane, and they didn't have enough fuel on board to come via Hong Kong through to Australia. That most planes passed through Darwin. They'd stopping there at this point in time, although some international flights did stop at Darwin. The Beatles plane wasn't scheduled. It was scheduled to go straight to Mascot in Sydney here, but because of the likely chance that it needed to be diverted, they had to take on extra fuel, and they tried to do that in Bangkok, but it was far too hot to take on the entire fuel load. And so the plan was made to stop in Darwin. About a bit after 2 a.m, BOAC leaked the news that the Beatles plane was going to be stopping in Darwin overnight, and about 500 kids heard this on the radio, and 8DN radio. John Edwards from 8DN radio was on hand in the Qantas lounge in Darwin Airport to get the first interview with the Beatles on Australian soil. And they were only there for about 20-30 minutes until they jumped back on the plane and continued on to Mascot. As fate would have it, they would land here in Sydney.
And John Edwards of Darwin is the man who said the memorable question, supposedly the first question asked to the Beatles when they got to Australia: "Welcome to Australia, which one am I talking to?"
Yeah, because he didn't know. Who knew? But he certainly didn't know, because he had his teenage stepdaughter with him, and he clearly didn't get any intel off her. But it was hurriedly organised. John had actually written to Brodziak weeks and weeks in advance, hoping to get an exclusive. And Ken's advice to John was like, "Look, they're not scheduled to stop in Darwin, John, so I'm sorry." But then when John kept writing and rewriting about various aspects of the tour, Ken gave him the flight number and said, "Look, there's a slim chance that they may need to stop at Darwin. We're not sure, but if so, you should get in touch with Derek Taylor or Neill Aspinall." And so when they were literally going to be stopping, John Edwards had the right people's names: Derek Taylor, their publicist, and Neill Aspinall, their road manager. So with those things in hand and the flight number, he was able to be on hand and get to the right people. And he trumped everybody, like literally Bob Rogers, who we just lost. Bob didn't get to interview the Beatles in Darwin. He did a live piece for 2SM Radio, but just commentating on the general arrival without any on-the-moment interviews with the boys.
Yeah. I've got a copy of Glenn A. Baker's book from 1982. Your book, I believe, is probably twice as big and has a lot more photos and information. How did you go about sourcing all of the new material?
Well, it was a bit of everything, really. I mean, it was really comprehensive how we went about it. I mean, for me personally, the one thing that with any book like this, you really have to build its foundations on solid research from the newspapers at the time. It's all very well speaking to people who are there or relying on, bits of information that you can get from various sources. But for me, the best source and the wellspring of everything is the original newspapers from the time. So I'd done the New Zealand newspapers, and when Greg and I agreed that we were really going to go to town on this project, on trips back, family trips to New Zealand, I would stop off in Australia and go through all the Australian dailies, and not just the cities that the tour went to. I checked the Perth newspaper, even Newcastle, north of Sydney.
Some of the regional ones.
Yeah, some of the regional papers. So that was sort of like the building blocks of the book. And then, the next thing, of course, is finding other written archives or, documentation that was made at the time that is pretty much conclusive as to how things were done, how they were set up, because sometimes people's memories, it's inevitable really, after 50, 60 years, the sort of the intricacies of things are going to fade. So when you've got, letters and official documents and whatever it may be from that dated from the time, then it's pretty much infallible, or, to actually pinpoint when things happened and how they happened. So that was a really important thing. And Greg touched upon earlier how we were initially looking at maybe trying to put it out 10 years ago for the 50th anniversary, but then this huge repository of letters, documents, and all sorts of things from the New Zealand side of the tour, which also encompassed a lot of the Australian material that was coming from Ken Brodziak's Aztec Services archive. Suddenly we had a much, much bigger picture. And that's what's really important in sort of getting the book as definitive as we think it is now.
Yeah.
And also, just to add to that, you know, meeting people that were still with us, stretching back before we officially declared there was a book, or for me anyway, back into 96 and 97, 1996, 97, talking to the lady that was at a restaurant in Melbourne up in the Dandenongs, Kenlock, you know, where George Harrison dropped in unexpectedly for lunch on the Wednesday afternoon off, where he wanted to escape the hotel, Southern Cross, talking to Dick Lean, who's long since passed, sadly, but getting a definitive story from Dick Lean, who was co-promoter on the Australasian Tour, particularly all the Australian side of it, but they did everything in tandem with New Zealand, with Kerry Jodian in New Zealand. These were the sorts of things that we got early, and we did over 100 interviews with key players, media people, people on the tour, support acts, fans, lots of fans.
In fact, seeing we're on Macleay Street, one of the best interviews for me that we managed to get was a guy called Peter Darwin, whose story is in the Sydney chapter, of course, being Macleay Street, but he climbed up the side of the Sheraton Hotel at night. Talk about absolute madness. You know, one false move, he would have been dead. And he climbed up to the 8th floor and got knocked on the window. Yeah. And as John Lennon said, he thought it was the others playing a prank. But he opened the French doors, and here was this kid who'd climbed up with his fingernails, just basically, you know, like Spider-Man getting up the side of the house, side of the hotel. You know, incredible, really.
And he's a Liverpudlian, so of course he was welcome.
Yeah.
He was welcomed in.
And he's now passed on. So again, it's sort of like, in some ways, we put the cart before the horse with a lot of these interviews, because we didn't have a publishing deal and we weren't sure how it was going to sort of play out. But we both realized the value of getting the interview when we had the opportunity. And of course, you know, that came, you know, it paid off a lot later when we were putting the book together, because a lot of these people had passed on.
And I think that's the last thought on that was, because it was truly a labour of love. We did it for ourselves primarily, and we wanted to learn from the people who were there. Just for, well, I know in my case personally, I wanted to know, and it's only through that badgering that somebody convinced me to put something in writing, and that the concept of a book was agreed to without any clue as to how that was ever going to happen. But of course, as good things happen, we're here today.
Yeah. So have either of you ever met a Beatle?
Yes.
I have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've met all of them except John Lennon. Yeah.
Very impressive. I've met Ringo Starr in person. I won't count Paul McCartney. I've seen him many, many times on stage, but I've never spoken to him. But Ringo Starr, I was fortunate to be at a meet and greet at an art gallery in Melbourne, the Silver K Gallery, in February 2013, and I was part of the lucky few that would be able to go up and have a brief word and a photograph with. So there's my great claim to fame. Oh, I have met Pete Best, by the way. Do we count Pete?
No, we don't.
Well, guys, When We Was Fab, Inside the Beatles Australasian Tour 1964 is out now. As a music fan, I say thank you for putting this together, and all the best with your promo tour.
Thank you, Greg. It's great talking to you.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you very much, Greg. It's great to get the word out there. Cheers.